We're going to start it now.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Stephanie. I'm one of the social workers here in the Wellness Center at Boston IVF. I am a licensed social worker in the state of Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. Today, as you know, we'll be doing a live Q&A in regards specifically to stress management and how to support your mental health through the IVF process. We decided to do this Q&A specifically geared towards this because we realize that there is a demand for mental health support, stress management as you're going through an inherently stressful process. And so we're hopeful that we can answer your questions and provide some education throughout this webinar. One thing I would like to say is that myself and my colleague Dylan, we are social workers. And so we are not MDs and we will not be able to answer any fertility questions specifically. So we would tell you to sort of defer any of that to your doctor or their nursing team.
Yeah. My name is Dylan. I'm also a licensed social worker. I'm the manager of mental health at the Wellness Center. So we are located in Waltham. Stephanie and I are both in the Waltham office most of the time. We kind of have two roles at Boston IVF. So we, half the time, are part of our third-party department. So that means we see patients who are working with either a gestational carrier, egg donor, sperm donor. So we work in kind of that field. So we have a lot of experience with third-party reproduction. And then we also are in the Wellness Center. So offering more of an emotional support setting. So kind of what people think of as traditional therapy. I am licensed in Massachusetts and Maine. And then we can obviously always see patients in person in Waltham. The Wellness Center also offers acupuncture. We have nutritionists on staff. So we do have a variety of services available to all of our patients. But for Stephanie and I, our role is really more of a therapeutic setting, as she said, to kind of help patients go through this process, which is super, super stressful for a lot of people. So we do see patients virtually. We see patients in person, again, in Waltham only. And then our license extends to Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire for now. But we will hopefully get a few more states covered in the future. So that is all, again, listed on our website, but those are really our primary services that we offer.
We know that counseling is really important during fertility care for a couple different reasons. This is an inherently stressful process, and so levels of stress increase either as you're getting ready for IVF, while you're in the process. We know that also the stress can exacerbate any existing mental health symptoms for patients that may be already prone to anxiety or depression or have been treated for those things in the past. We also know that IVF can be a really isolating experience, or it can feel that way, despite the fact that we know 1 in 6 couples undergo fertility struggles. I think partially this isolating experience comes from the fact that IVF is a really unique experience, and there are a lot of different reasons why patients and couples seek out the assistance of IVF. And so while you might know someone else who's going through the process, their circumstances and their experience can be totally different. There is no typical fertility patient, we know, and so a lot of the care that you get for your own mental health needs to be specialized and needs to be tailored to your specific experience and needs. There is also just a lot of uncertainty of the outcome. Everyone has a different experience, as we mentioned, and there is no crystal ball to know what your experience will be like. And in a lot of ways, that uncertainty creates more anxiety and creates more stress because there is a lot of lack of control. And through this process, there is grief around sort of losing that illusion of control or not knowing kind of what to expect and the uncertainty of it all. There are a lot of moving pieces that include a lot of different aspects of your life, and they're all just sort of coming ahead during this process.
think a lot of it also has to do with the message that most people are taught growing up, which is you don't use birth control and then you'll inevitably get pregnant and call it a day. And it'll just be really easy. It'll be quick. And then I think when patients end up as a patient here and they're struggling to get pregnant, it can just be really unexpected. And so a lot of that does come with the grief that Stephanie mentioned of it didn't just happen spontaneously. It didn't happen easily. And for patients having that experience, it can feel like everyone else is just getting pregnant easily and quickly. So I think a lot of people who walk through our door in general are pretty disappointed to be here, happy that our services exist and that they are being well cared for at Boston IVF. But in general, I don't think this is being a patient here is not something that a lot of people anticipate as being part of their reproductive story. So most people would like to get pregnant at home and for free and have it feel like a much less medical scientific process that doesn't have other people in the room or constant appointments or medications or shots or all of these much more unpleasant things that come with fertility treatment. So there's a lot of just disappointment of being here in the first place, and that can be really difficult. I would say another part that's unique in terms of the stress that comes with fertility is that it just impacts a lot of areas of somebody's life. So there's the emotional piece, there's the physical piece, there's the financial piece. So it kind of bleeds into all of these other areas of life. For a lot of people, there's an impact on their marriage, their relationship with their partner, for their intimacy, for friendships. Holidays can be really tough, family relationships, interacting with colleagues. It just kind of shows up in a lot of different places. And I think it can also have an impact on your relationship with yourself and your body and just morale. So it can just feel like a very discouraging, difficult experience for most patients. It can just feel really overwhelming to be struggling in that many areas of your life sort of simultaneously, to have everything just really feeling hard all at once and have that be so unexpected and unpredictable. Question that we just got in the chat says, how can I schedule acupuncture before my embryo transfer next week? So best way to schedule acupuncture is to call the wellness center. If you are already coming into Waltham for blood work or an ultrasound or some other type of procedure, you can absolutely just stop in at the front desk and get scheduled. So the wellness center is right through that main entrance in Waltham. So you go in the front door. When you walk in, there's your main desk. But if you take a right, there's another reception desk. And so they can book an appointment right there. So you're welcome to do that in person. You can also call the wellness center anytime. That phone number is on our website. If you're on right now, it is also 781-434-6578. So that is a really popular service for our patients. They will do acupuncture right before your transfer. You will go have your transfer, you'll empty your bladder, and then you'll come back and you can do another brief acupuncture session with one of our acupuncturists. We have 4 on staff and they're here 7 days a week, so can pretty easily accommodate acupuncture needs.
What makes the care team here at the Wellness Center a little different from other counselors that are outside of our clinic and the Wellness Center here is that we do have an understanding of the science and the medical process that goes into IVF. And in a lot of ways, that can be a relief to our patients that they are then not responsible for trying to educate their counselor on the medical process of IVF, all of the moving parts that we talked about before. And we can really just focus on your emotional processing, working on coping strategies that are helpful and specific to you and your needs. We also are integrated with the medical team, and so we're able to sort of collaborate in that way also. And so I know that a lot of the burden on some patients can be sort of feeling responsible to educate their counselor and trying to sort of help them understand the unique aspects of IVF, where we already know that, and we can sort of help provide other insight because we work with IVF patients all day. And so not only are we trained and we have sort of the background based on research, but we also know kind of anecdotally what patients tell us that is difficult and maybe sometimes it's not always captured through research. And so we just have a better basic understanding of the medical process, but the other kind of unique aspects also.
Next question in the chat says, what advice do you have for asking someone, a known person, to be a sperm donor? So it's a really good question. Can feel like a really overwhelming task. Initially, I would say to have more than one person that you're kind of considering asking. It can take a little bit of that pressure off, where it doesn't feel like it's a this person better say yes or we have no one. So really kind of exploring all of your options, really thinking it through. I would say including that person's partner in the conversation. But if we're really just talking about like that first step in broaching the topic, I suggest through text or email. And I also would recommend putting it out there that this is a question you want to ask them, that you understand it is a really big ask and that you would like them to take time to think about it. So it would be totally appropriate to say, I have a really big question to ask you. I would like you to take 48 hours to think about it before you even consider responding. If you ask me questions about this before 48 hours, I'm not going to respond, but to really kind of require that it is something that they think through, to also set the precedent that they can ask any questions that they want, that it is an open conversation, really that it'll be a collaborative conversation on what would that look like for them to be your sperm donor. I think it's also totally appropriate to set a disclaimer of like, to say to the person you've asked, hey, if you want to pretend you never received this email and it makes you uncomfortable, I won't bring it up again. So to kind of give them an out that would not impact your friendship or family relationship in a negative way. So that's also appropriate to just say, hey, I know it's a hard ask. If you are not into this, all good. That's totally fine. But that really is kind of that initial step. So usually that's how the conversation begins. And then if that person comes back and says, hey, I'd like to know more about what you had in mind, also very appropriate. So that's where you start talking about the relationship, what that would look like. And that's also a point where it would be really appropriate to bring in a third party. So that's something that Stephanie and I also do, is have those conversations with people of what's it going to look like? What's the relationship going to be? What does it mean to be the donor? What's your title? What's your identity? Who knows, who doesn't? So really ironing out all of those things. So I would say step one is kind of navigating that part pretty independently. You are more than welcome to bring us in for step two.
Our next question is, what are your recommendations when it comes to talking to family and friends about going through fertility treatment? My understanding of this question is talking about your own fertility treatment with family and friends. My suggestion is to always start by telling the people that you trust and support you the most, kind of finding your safe people first, and sort of just explaining to them what you feel comfortable in sharing. No one is really entitled to your medical history, and so what you feel comfortable and safe to share is entirely dependent on you. And so I usually suggest starting with your kind of close inner circle and allowing yourself to share what feels right. I think if you feel comfortable, it's also okay to sort of set some boundaries there. I know a lot of patients feel this anxiety of, I've told some friends and family, and now I'm getting lots of questions that either I'm not ready to answer or you don't want to answer. I want to answer in my own time. And so it is okay to set boundaries around what you want the support to look like or what you're comfortable sort of answering as you go through this process. I find that your support system most of the time will respect what you need, and they are very eager to support you in the way that they can. And so if you're able to say, these follow-up questions are hard for me to answer when I'm not ready to, then say that. I think it's also okay to sort of let people in a little bit. I know that there's a lot of apprehension around, I don't want to burden anyone else sort of with what I'm going through, although again, your support system wants to be there for you as best as they can. And oftentimes it could even be a good way to build community. It could be a way to connect to other couples or patients that are also going through IVF. And so I would say sort of trust your gut with who you want to tell. And sort of kind of prepare ahead of time what information you feel comfortable sharing, what information you don't feel comfortable sharing. Also include your partner in on this, because sometimes it is their medical history too. And so you want to make sure that you're sort of on the same page with what you're comfortable sharing with who.
I think there's also a little bit of a lack of understanding of timeline when it comes to doing IVF. And so I see patients run into that sometimes with sharing with friends or family, that they will share with a friend or family member, hey, we're going to do IVF, and that parents or friends or whoever they've shared with are expecting an update a few days later. And as most of you know, this process is long. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. And 5 days later, someone is probably not going to have an update. Nothing will really have changed. And so, like Stephanie said, to kind of set those boundaries of, hey, I'm doing IVF and this is something I want you to know about because you're important to me. When I have something to share, when I have an update I want to share, I'll tell you. But to kind of set that boundary of like, maybe please don't ask me for updates. There probably won't be one for a while. And when there's something to know, I'll tell you. But I think she mentioned it can be really hard to feel like you're constantly fielding questions and like they're just ready for an update a little faster than one is available. You want me to? Yeah. The next question is, patient who's starting IVF in a few months and anxious about doing that home shots. Super, super valid. A lot of people, I think, feel really anxious about that those first few days. It's a big responsibility, and most IVF patients are not medical professionals. So very reasonable, super common. We do offer patient education here too. So if that is helpful to people to come and have, you know, a Zoom consult or just have somebody guiding you those first couple of times, totally doable. I think most patients do find that after the first few days, they're like, oh, this is not anywhere nearly as complicated as I thought it was going to be. We also provide patient education videos. And so for some patients, it's really helpful to pull that video up, do it live while you're doing your own, pause, rewind, double check your work, have a friend or family member there who is kind of guiding you, even if it's just for moral support. So, you know, you guys are totally capable of doing this, but when it does feel like a lot of pressure to be the one administering your own medications, it's really fair to not feel qualified to do that. So tap into your resources, whether that's with us, you have a friend or family member who's a nurse and can just be an extra set of eyes. Again, even if that's just encouraging you that you are doing it correctly. Totally fair to have that. But we are always happy to provide education virtually, in person, whatever would make people feel more comfortable.
And if there are ways that you know that you learn better, whether that's through picture or audio or just repetition, if you sort of let us know your learning style, we can tailor our education to that so that you're best receiving the information and that you also feel confident with the information that you're getting.
Another question is asking about mental health providers in Rhode Island. So we're working on a Rhode Island license for one of us. It's on the list. It's a long process, but hopefully one of us will become licensed in Rhode Island. Until then, we do keep a list of providers that we're aware of who just specialize in the field of infertility. So we are always happy to provide that list to our patients. Disclaimer is some of them are accepting new patients, some of them are not. Some take insurance, others are self-pay only. So it would then be the patient's responsibility to kind of look at that list of providers and see who takes their insurance and what self-pay cost is. And so we don't keep it up to date in that sense of knowing always who's available and who's not, but we are more than happy to provide names in your area. So this question says, I found myself dealing with emotions I wasn't expecting when asked about adoption, guilt, selfishness. It's a really common one. We actually see that a lot. And so I think it's very important to remember that adoption is a great way to grow your family, but it's also a way that is available to most people, whether you struggle with fertility or not. And so I often find patients who are struggling with this feeling a responsibility. And so again, adoption is available to most people, and it is not the responsibility of couples or individuals struggling with fertility or same-sex couples to adopt all the children of the world. And so it is also okay to, turn that back on someone. So if someone's saying, well, are you considering adoption? You might say, no, did you? Even if they have biological children. So again, that's available to all, whether it is the only way you might be able to grow your family or not. If you decide later on that you would like to pursue adoption, great. If it's not the right fit for you, that's okay. I think adoption also has this image of being quick and easy, and it's also not. So IVF treatment is slow and takes a long time, and adoption does also. So it's not the right fit for everyone, and there shouldn't be any additional pressure to expect that fertility patients are, just going to adopt all the kids.
The next question is, how do you recommend your patients deal with the 2-week wait? So this is a really common question. So essentially we give sort of general recommendations, healthy distractions, being social, meeting with friends and family, physical activity, engaging in your support networks, self-care, whatever that looks like for you. Those are all good sort of general suggestions. Although I think sort of the best, or one of the best ways to sort of support yourself through this entire process is really to seek out your own individual support. Talking with a therapist, maybe engaging in some support groups, because you really want the opportunity to just talk about your experience and the emotions behind it and sort of what it feels like and to process that. I think the hope for a lot of us that are managing stress and anxiety is that there possibly is this magic wand we can wave and that we won't feel it anymore or that it vanishes. Although we know that that's not how our feelings and our emotions work. And so what I would say is kind of create a self-care list for you that you can sort of turn to in moments where you're feeling more anxious. But I think the best thing to do is really to find sort of your own supports that you can talk about your emotions, where they're coming from, how to process them, and what to do with them. I think in the 2-week wait, one of the best things I can recommend is sort of just positive, healthy distraction. We're always going to sort of be thinking about the next milestone, and it's good to sort of acknowledge that, acknowledge the thought, acknowledge that you're thinking of it, but then how do we sort of transition to focusing on the present, being in the moment, sort of just allowing whatever to happen without trying to put too much expectation or pressure on ourselves. I think the second part of that question was related to sort of a failed IVF cycle and how do you recommend dealing with the loss while moving forward to the next session? I think that's really challenging for most. But in terms of loss, it's important to sort of honor the loss and to allow yourself to grieve. And for some, they can do that while simultaneously holding on to this optimistic hope and moving forward. And if you're able to sort of balance the two at the same time, that's normal. This process comes with a lot of conflicting feelings. But if it feels helpful to give yourself some time in between so that you can take more time to process or rest, that's a personal choice that is a good fit for some people. For others, it's not, based on different factors potentially. And so again, in those moments, find support that you can talk about your grief and process your grief while also talking about this kind of cautious optimism that you hold on the other side.
Some logistics questions. Is there a wellness center in the South Portland office? There is not. We are the only wellness center here in Waltham. Again, though, we can see our Maine patients virtually for therapy, so that is something we can offer. But in terms of acupuncture and nutrition, we are the only wellness center, so that would be Waltham. And then another logistics question is there a financial or insurance resource available for the office, through the office to speak to? We do have medical billing. They can absolutely help with some of those questions related to what your policy covers. Sometimes it'll be a matter of calling your insurance, but we do have some staff here who can help guide with financial questions.
We do also have staff that can help with any financial burden that is being reported. We have staff that can help with learning of different grants that you can apply to. It is sometimes dependent on your certain circumstance and situations, but there is some financial assistance that you could explore.
Is acupuncture available in Albany? Acupuncture is not available through Boston IVF in Albany. So there are acupuncturists all over who do specialize in fertility. They just are not through us. So again, our only acupuncture is here in Waltham. We do have 4 providers 7 days a week, but it is in Waltham, Mass. And are either of us licensed in Maine? We are both licensed in Maine. So yep, we can see therapy patients virtually who reside in Maine.
How do you, or excuse me, do you have recommendations on how to handle weight, body changes, and self-esteem during IVF? This is really common because it is sort of inevitable. And so the relationship that you have with yourself and your body will likely change and be examined. I think the most important thing I can tell folks is just to sort of give yourself grace, right? Your body is going through sort of a tremendous amount of stress and preparation to, receive an embryo transfer and get pregnant. And so with that, is again, sort of a loss of control of how our body changes physically. And so I think it's okay to just sort of give yourself grace and allow kind of those changes to come, and also sort of celebrate that those changes mean that you're kind of working towards this goal of getting pregnant and having a family. And part of that is just sort of giving up part of your old self. And sometimes that is, kind of what your body looks like, but it is doing a tremendous thing. And so in the other flip side, you can sort of value this amazing transformation that your body is able to do.
Best way to tell someone you don't want to discuss next steps of your IVF journey. Really important. Boundaries are so big when going through this process. I think one question that you can ask someone in response to their questions is like really simple, just a why do you ask? And so if someone is asking you, what type of treatment are you doing? What's next for you guys? When is it happening? Then it's totally fine to say, oh, why do you ask? And so that's a little bit just trying to identify, are they asking because they just want an update? Are they asking because maybe they're being a little bit nosy and, violating a little bit of your boundaries? Or are they asking because maybe they're struggling with fertility and are looking for guidance themselves? And so sometimes I find that having information as to where their question is coming from makes it a little bit easier to answer. And so if they're saying, I just want to know because I'm worried about you and I want to support you, sometimes that's an easier question to then, decide how you want to respond to. If they say, oh, I'm just curious, that might feel like they're being a little bit nosy. And again, as Stephanie mentioned, like, you don't owe anyone updates. This is your personal life. There is a difference between things being secret and things being private. And so the fact that you're doing IVF doesn't have to be a big secret. It doesn't have to be shameful. You don't have to be fearful that somebody will know about it, but it is perfectly appropriate for it to be private. It's your medical information. It's not something that's available for all people to know about, to weigh in on. It's very appropriate to just say, oh, I will give you updates when I have them, but I'm not really comfortable talking about it right now. Say, you don't know what next steps are looking like. I think it's okay to say, we're doing fertility treatment and it's taking a little longer than expected. So operating somewhere in the gray area, you don't have to give them zero information, but maybe you don't want to give them 100% play-by-play details. So to just say we're doing treatment and we hope it's successful is also okay to set those boundaries and be confident that you are only sharing what you're comfortable with, because once you share, you can't unshare. So it's always okay to give somebody more information later. But again, that's your private life. That's okay to keep to yourself or between you and a partner. this next question is kind of in relation to people asking for details. Any insight into how? Yeah, so just how do we answer people's questions when they are asking questions that are, violating boundaries a little bit? So again, kind of what we just talked about of just saying, why do you ask? Or that's private, or that's personal. That we don't always know what's going on in people's private lives. We don't know how long somebody has been trying for, that this is personal, it's private. It is okay for it to stay between you and your partner, and to be pretty firm and confident in your answers. So not necessarily needing to go into detail, maintaining your privacy without it crossing the line into secrecy is okay. It's okay to say, oh, that's private. We're not really comfortable sharing. We hope to have a baby soon. We don't know what's going on in people's private lives. And so we don't always have to answer people's questions if it doesn't feel like something you're comfortable openly talking about. Yeah.
Our next question is, I've been struggling with the fear of another failed cycle. Is there something you suggest to get through that feeling? So I think, of course, sort of acknowledging that the feeling exists, knowing that it's sort of rooted in past experiences and also anxiety, right? Anxiety is fear of the future, worrying about the unknown or the outcome. So I think first you need to sort of acknowledge that the feeling is there and it exists, and also giving yourself grace that it's valid. Having experienced a failed cycle will, of course, increase anxiety for the next cycle because you've had this experience of the outcome not being what you want it to be. And so it's very normal and natural to think, what if this happens again? And we don't have any way of sort of fully reassuring you that it will or it won't, right? It is a possibility of IVF. I think, again, this is a really good reason to sort of have that built-in support already so that you can have a safe space to process feelings of fear and whatever else might accompany that, right? Shame or betrayal or guilt or whatever kind of you're feeling alongside of that. And so I'm a big believer in two things can be true at the same time. And so while you can hold on to this fear and this anxiety, I would also encourage you to sort of lean into some of that hope also, in that, we don't know what the outcome will be. And so we don't want to sort of assign an outcome before anything has happened. And we know that, the options are open still because it hasn't happened. And so acknowledge the fear, also lean into the hope.
This patient said they've been given contact information for acquaintances who have IVF experience but haven't reached out. Do we recommend that they do that? I think it's kind of a mix. Every person who has gone through fertility treatment is different. There's no typical IVF patient. And so I think that part can be really challenging in trying to relate to other people's experiences. And so we see patients who are 25, 35, 45, female factor, male factor, both, PCOS, cancer history, endometriosis. There's same-sex couples. There's just such a huge range in what brought somebody to IVF. And so if your experience is really different than that person's, I think that can feel challenging and sometimes make you feel more isolated. It also depends on what their outcome was. So when you speak to someone who went through IVF and they have 3 happy, healthy children and you're on your 2nd or 3rd failed transfer, I think sometimes it can bring up feelings of jealousy of why did it work so quickly and easily or seemingly so for them and it isn't for me. So I think it just depends on what you're looking for. If it's for educational purposes, like support around doing injections, things like that, sure, I think it's nice to have an ally, someone who's been there. But if you're looking for a reassurance that, this can work, sometimes that's helpful in speaking to people who've had experience. And I think sometimes it's not. If their experience is too different from yours, it can kind of feel like, well, worked for them, but won't for me or vice versa. So it can be helpful, but again, everyone's experience here is so different. What brought them here is so different. And so sometimes I think it's best to have a little bit more of an individual experience or to be in a support group that has more of a focus. So, women who are single moms by choice, or like a little bit more of a common ground as opposed to just IVF. IVF is so broad. And that's one of our other questions is, does Boston IVF offer virtual support groups? So we don't right now. We used to have a support group in pre-COVID days, the Mind Body program, and that hasn't run since for a few years now. But we are hoping to bring back some virtual support groups with the plan to be about once a month, have a different topic that is focused on. And if there's traction and people are interested in that, then we would definitely hope to broaden the offerings. But within the next couple of months, we do hope to get some support groups going virtually if people are interested.
The next question is, what are some strategies you recommend when it comes to dealing with friends getting pregnant while I'm going through treatment? This is also a very good question. It's a question that we get often, mostly because it can be very triggering to see other family, friends, neighbors, random people at the grocery store, at the post office, being pregnant, having young children. That can be really difficult for someone who's actively in treatment. And so I think, sort of the first thing that has to be acknowledged is that it's probably unlikely that you can sort of avoid all of it 100% of the time. Although, sort of with the theme that we've been mentioning, I think boundaries are really important in terms of just self-preservation and kind of protecting your mental health. Now, it'll be different depending on who it is, right? If it's your sister or if it's your cousin or someone in your family that you might see frequently, is it realistic to think that, you'll be able to limit yourself from that person for however long? Probably not the most realistic. However, on social media or with acquaintances, if there are people that you can sort of limit your exposure to them or your access to them so that it's not so constant and overwhelming, then, sort of limit access on social media. Do not kind of go looking for other forums like on Reddit. I know that that is so tempting. Although Reddit is not your friend and it is not a medical provider, and also the context of what you're reading is not in the context of your own medical journey, your family building journey, and so it's not really applicable. So I would really try to set boundaries where you can, and if you have to say no to certain things, like if you have to say no to a baby shower, if you have to say no to, your college friend's son's first birthday, that is okay. Those are good boundaries to put in place for yourself. And really, you should take care of you more than anything. You're going through so much already, mentally, physically, emotionally, that sort of pushing yourself over the limit isn't going to do you any favors. Limits are in place for a good reason. It lets us know right before we're going to fall off the edge. And so sort of listening to your limits and what boundaries best suit you, you need to do that sort of unapologetically. And so saying no, limiting social media access is sometimes really helpful. And also sort of just realizing that like you will be triggered. Sometimes like it is going to elicit an emotion. Sometimes you will be angry. Sometimes you will be upset. Give yourself, the time and space to sort of manage that or feel that in the moment. If it's something that you need to sort of remove yourself and go home, that's okay. If it's something where you need to sort of separate from the group dinner or the party for 10 minutes so that you can work on breathing exercises or just take some breaths in private or talk to your partner, then do that. Do what you need to.
I think too, depending on the relationship with the person, for example, if you know in advance that you and a friend are both trying to get pregnant, I think it can cause a lot of anxiety for patients to constantly feel like, oh, they're going to tell me they're pregnant. What if I go to this dinner? Is someone going to announce at this holiday that they're expecting? So to have that fear, like when is the other shoe going to drop, knowing it's going to be hurtful for you. And so if it's someone who is really close to you in your personal life and you guys are pretty open about the fact that they're trying and you're trying but struggling, I think it's also okay to have a game plan. To say, hey, if you find out you're pregnant before me, I would really appreciate it if you could tell me privately, or I would really appreciate it if you could tell me via text that I will be so happy for you, but understandably maybe sad for me. And it would be helpful to be able to process that privately without an audience, without them looking to you to have a big congratulations reaction. So have a game plan too. If it's someone who's close to you, it's just saying like, this is how I would like to be told, if possible. Not always possible. Sometimes you will be caught off guard, but I do think that can relieve a lot of stress to just know like, okay, this person will not drop a bomb at Christmas and announce their pregnancy in front of our whole family, that you will have the privacy you need and maybe a day or two before you have to see them in person. Love yourself if it does feel hurtful. Yeah. How do you choose to continue with another IUI or make the switch to IVF? Well, this one's really a pretty personal choice. It depends on your medical history, what brought you to IVF or what brought you to fertility treatment, and definitely want to talk through with your doctor. We see patients who make this switch for such a variety of reasons. A lot of it has to do with health insurance, and what coverage people have is a pretty common way of deciding what's available. So some policies require a certain number of IUIs before switching to IVF. It's a totally reasonable way to make some decisions, and talking to your doctor. There's not really a right or a wrong in general, though, besides what your doctor recommends. So I do see patients who prefer to kind of the path of least intervention as much as possible and would really like to kind of feel like they've given IUI a very fair shot before switching to IVF. Other patients say, nope, IVF has a higher success rate than IUI. Like, let's do the thing that gives me the highest chance of success as fast as possible. It really depends on your comfort level. It depends on your medical history. It depends on doctor's recommendation, but everybody's path and their comfort is kind of different.
Are there any online support resources that you recommend? So there are lots of resources that Dylan and I share with patients constantly, depending on what it is that they're looking for, what there is that they're experiencing in that moment. For IVF patients in general, there is a great support group through Postpartum Support International. Again, that's Postpartum Support International. They have a list of support groups, but one specifically is IVF. And so that is for patients or partners that have been experiencing IV or infertility struggles for 6 months or longer. The groups are facilitated by someone who themselves has either experienced primary infertility or secondary infertility. What's really nice about this group is that it is virtual and it is free through PSI. And so that can be a really great resource. Other resources that we share are books about sort of surviving IVF, the A to Z questions of IVF. Podcasts are also a really great way to sort of learn more information, connect with other folks that have gone through this lived shared experience. And there are certain organizations like Resolve that have lots of resources and support groups specifically for those going through IVF. And then we also have specific resources for those that might be considering using donor egg, donor sperm, donor embryo, gestational carrier. And so our resources are not only for adults, but we also share resources for future children, existing siblings. And so there is a lot out there that exists.
Any holiday specific coping methods, strategies you recommend? Really good question. Holidays are so hard for people. As we've talked a little bit about boundaries in general, but also really with social media, I think the holidays can be a really hard time. Most people are getting holiday cards, are seeing these family photos. It tends to be a time of year that, at least from a social media perspective, I think looks like a highlight reel of like these happy smiling families with all these healthy kids. And, you know, we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. I think holidays are really stressful for a lot of people. We don't necessarily know how people's children came into the world. They might have also struggled with fertility, but it is a time of year that really looks like everything is just happy and perfect. So reminding yourself that that is usually not the case for most. Setting boundaries again, though, if going to holidays feels uncomfortable, if you have pregnant family members, it is okay to skip a holiday. It is okay to go for a shortened amount of time. It is okay to travel. It's okay to take care of you first. And so going through fertility treatment is growing your family, and you can prioritize your immediate nuclear family over your extended family when you need to. That is okay. Staying off social media, though, not attending if it doesn't feel comfortable. attending for less time, having a game plan with your partner or spouse of how long we're gonna stay, and if this comes up or this happens, we're gonna leave. Like we just talked about, also, if you think that there's someone who might announce a pregnancy, to just know that in advance, hope that it's not a part of your holiday that might be dropped on you. We also are hoping in our planned future support groups to have a group around the time of the holidays, because this is a really common time of year that people struggle. Holidays also do fall at the end of the year, and so I think there's also this piece for a lot of patients who feel like, oh, I thought I was going to get pregnant in 2024 and it is about to be 2025 and I'm not pregnant. And so just that little milestone, I think, can really be challenging. So with the New Year's resolutions and things like that comes a lot of disappointment. And so it's also okay to grieve of like, that's what I expected my year to look like. I thought I was going to be pregnant. I thought I was going to have a baby born. I thought whatever ideas of what you thought the year was going to be like. And here you are, and it's different. There's a lot of grief that comes with that. And so processing some of that grief with friends, with family, with support network, with a therapist, and then setting some intentions for the following year. But the timing, I think, of holidays, like end of year holidays and New Year's is really challenging.
What is the best way to respond to someone who says, well, at least you can get pregnant?
After having had miscarriages.
So the other comment here is I find this question terribly hurtful, unintentional, right? And so we know that even if things are said with a different intention, we know that they can still be hurtful, even if that wasn't the intent behind them. And so I think the best way to respond when someone says, well, at least you can get pregnant, is yes, but right, there is lots of grief that comes with it, especially if you've experienced 3 miscarriages or 4 miscarriages. And so sometimes even being able to get pregnant, but knowing that there is this history of miscarriage can even be more anxiety provoking, because yes, you got pregnant, but there is this sort of anxiety of, will I stay pregnant? And like we've mentioned throughout this whole webinar, like there is just so much grief associated with this entire process. And so yes, you can get pregnant, but we don't know kind of what steps you had to take to get pregnant. And maybe that in of itself looks so different than what you've experienced in the past or what you thought it was going to look like to get pregnant. And then to know that you've had sort of multiple losses, that's devastating. That's grief. And so for someone to say, well, at least you can get pregnant, you know, my response to them would be, well, you know, you don't know the entire situation. And while I can get pregnant, there is still this overarching anxiety of, will I stay pregnant? Will I have to suffer this other loss that is very real? So I don't know. I don't know if I have an exact kind of response back to that. I mean, I probably do, but not something I want to say on this webinar. But yeah, I don't know what I would say other than, you know, that's really not helpful for me to hear. Maybe I would say something like that. Like, that's not helpful for me to hear. That's actually not comforting for me to hear. And maybe letting that person know, because again, the intention of that person might be, well, hang in there, you know, there's still hope, you can get pregnant, but they might not understand the rest of the history there. And so in turn, if you can say, like, I know you're trying to help, but that's actually not helpful to me, it's more hurtful, that might actually help that person understand, like, oh, I'm not helping them in the way that they need, or I'm not supporting them in the way that they find helpful. And so sort of letting them know that, I think, is just a way to sort of educate them, like, that's not the support I'm looking for. That's not kind of this like toxic positivity that I'm looking for. You know, a lot of the times I'm sure you're just looking to be heard and validated.
And remember, I think it is coming from their own discomfort of they don't know what to say or how to navigate that. And it is more their lack of knowledge on what is appropriate, and has nothing to do with you or what you need or what you deserve. It is their own kind of shortcomings of not knowing how to handle that, and probably just feeling really uncomfortable if they know your history of miscarriage. It's not something as a society I think we're that great at talking about yet, like moving in the right direction, sort of. But it's different. It's not like a death of a family member where people know to say, like, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, or go to a funeral, or there's a little bit more of a protocol associated with it. I think miscarriages, we're still people kind of flub it a little and get nervous. And this kind of goes along with our next question, which is, I want to be able to support my friend. What's the best way for me to do that? Which I'm so happy someone's asking that. That's so important. I think this is a great example. Don't do that. Don't say things that are really unhelpful. It's so tempting to feel uncomfortable, to not know what to say, and to kind of throw something at it, like, well, at least you can get pregnant, or have fun trying. I hear that one sometimes, and no. So to just be really aware of if you're saying something that you genuinely think is going to be helpful for them, or if you're saying it because you're feeling your own discomfort. But the best thing you can do is just listen and validate that this experience really sucks for most people. There isn't really another way to look at it. Of going through fertility treatment sucks. And that you're really sorry that that's their experience and how disappointing it is. And just to really offer that validation that they're going through something hard every single day, and that you want to be a support, that maybe you don't know that much about it. But then also to take some ownership and educate yourself a little bit so that they then aren't feeling the burden of having to teach you. But active listening, having a little bit of background information, I think is huge. Avoiding unsolicited advice or unhelpful comments like this one we just mentioned, as tempting as it can be to be like, well, my cousin stopped trying or filled out adoption papers and then they got pregnant or went on vacation, and the success stories of, and then that'll happen to you, as much as you can avoid those types of stories, because I think we're trying to be helpful by saying, like, don't lose hope. Oftentimes it comes across as really invalidating and makes people feel like, well, that's nice that all those people got pregnant, but I'm not, and that they're not valid for feeling the way that they are. So active listening, like we spoke about a little bit, if you're finding out that you are pregnant while your friend is struggling, to be very thoughtful about how you tell them. Typically with some privacy over text is preferred, I think, by most people. Even just letting a friend know that you want to be helpful to them and aren't really sure how to do it, that's great. One of the resources that Stephanie mentioned, resolve.org, they're the National Infertility Association, and they do have a page on their website that's called Infertility Etiquette. And that's a really good resource too, of just things to say, things not to say, what can and cannot be helpful. But active listening, validating, avoiding toxic positivity. You're not being asked to fix it. I think that's really important to keep in mind. And but hopefully your friend has a doctor that they trust and who has a good plan in place for them. And so the responsibility of getting friend pregnant is of their doctor, and your job is to just be there as a resource and support.
There is a lot of power in just presence, being able to be present with someone who is kind of going through something difficult. And yeah, sometimes, like Dylan mentioned, it's so tempting to want to say the right thing or to say like that perfect phrase that will just make it all better, but it doesn't exist. What does exist is being present, actively listening, and just validating what your friend is going through.
Question is related to cancer history and having done chemotherapy and now being referred back to Boston IVF. So we do have a handful of patients who have previous oncology history. So that is something that is kind of a specific resource that we can definitely help connect people with. Oncofertility is its own separate field. Really, when it comes to just the anxiety of being back into this world of fertility treatment, having an individualized support plan and therapy can make a big difference. Part of this question says, I'm turning 37 this week and this geriatric pregnancy. I hate the term geriatric pregnancy, but I know it's part of the field. Our bodies do, of course, age. We're born with all the eggs we're ever going to have, and that can feel really overwhelming to a lot of women, I think. That being said, geriatric pregnancy technically starts at 35, and the night you turn 35 or turn 36, your body doesn't go through a drastic change. So it's a factor, but it's not everything. There's more to your body. There's more to your medical history than just that age on a piece of paper. So it is definitely something we're comfortable helping support people through who have a cancer history. Can be really overwhelming to be back in this world. I think just taking it all one day at a time, having your return to care consult, step one, figuring out what the plan is going to be. If sometimes patients who do have chemo history end up using donor, eggs or sperm. And so we do have a donor egg seminar that patients start with. They meet with us individually. There really is a lot of guidance on just what options are available. And our job is to give you options. We're here to give you options, give you suggestions, and then you get to be the one to decide what feels comfortable for you. So we can give the resources, we can give the education, but we would need to have a little more information to know what specifically would be helpful for you.
Our last question is, do you have any tips for staying in the moment? I often find myself jumping ahead in the timeline and thinking, worrying about the next milestones in the process. So for staying in the moment, I would just, suggest kind of relying on those self-care activities that you like doing, right? Whether that's kind of going and hang out with friends, getting your nails done, being outside in nature, kind of reconnecting with nature. Reading a book, journaling can be really helpful. Watching a comfort TV show can sometimes be really helpful, or listening to a favorite playlist that you've curated, just doing things that sort of help to bring you joy and focusing on kind of, your senses. That's one of the best ways to stay present, right? Focus on what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're feeling. In a lot of ways that just forces us to be more present with ourselves. And I think, you can cut yourself some slack because of course you're always going to think about sort of the next step. I think that's part of human nature, but try not to assign an outcome to that yet. These things haven't happened. And so we know that, the possibility could be endless. And all you really have to focus on is what you're going through in the moment. And so trying to kind of keep your stress as well managed as you can is a really good idea, but also knowing that, a healthy level of stress is kind of part of life. And so we need to rely on our coping for that. But yeah, just kind of focus on like what brings you joy in that moment. Healthy distractions are always helpful.
I think it can also be a time to like take off your fertility patient hat. And so while you are pretty overwhelmed with this process, make sure you're also dedicating time to like your role as possibly a sister or daughter, or maybe already a mom or a wife or a friend, to make sure that those other areas of your life are also getting some of your attention, because it's huge. But our other areas of our life do need some of that time too. So to just say, okay, I'm going to take like a few hours break from being fertility patient mode, and I'm going to go be a sister or whatever else that looks like for you. So making sure you're giving some love and attention to these other parts of you and your life is also really important.
I think those are all of our questions.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you guys for joining. There's another live tonight focused on male factor fertility. I think that starts at 7. So there is an RSVP link as well if you want to be part of that. If Wellness Center services would be helpful for you, that number is 781-434-6578.